There are countless deck variations and ways to play Clash Royale, but some playstyles really stick out to be the absolute worst to face. They're either downright unfair or so brain-dead that losing to them makes you lose your mind. And what better way to start than with Hog 2.6? There's something uniquely frustrating about watching a 17 Elixir push get completely shut down by a cannon, an ice spirit, and a handful of skeletons. It just doesn't feel fair, and I guess that's kind of the point, because Hog 2.6 isn't really about the cards. It's about the playstyle. This deck is built around one idea: cycling faster than your opponent can keep up. If they have a counter to your Hog Rider, you don't try to break through it, you just get back to another Hog before they can use it again. And that completely changes how the game feels. Instead of trading pushes or building up pressure, you're stuck in this constant loop where you're always reacting. You defend the Hog, reset, and before you can even stabilize, there's another one coming. And at the same time, they're defending everything you do with the absolute minimum: ice golem to kite, cannon in the perfect tile, skeletons and ice spirit filling every gap. It's not overwhelming in the traditional sense, it's efficient. Almost too efficient, and that is where the frustration comes from. You're not getting crushed by a big push, you're not losing huge chunks of damage all at once. You're just never gaining control. Even when you defend perfectly, it doesn't feel like progress, because nothing actually changes. The cycle continues, and you're right back in the same situation yet again. And this is where the debate around the deck really comes in, because on one side, it is very clearly skill-based. Everything relies on precision, placements, timing, cycle management, tracking your opponent's cards, all that. At a high level, it's one of the cleanest tests of fundamentals in the game, but on the other side, that doesn't really change how it feels to play against, because when you're the one defending it, the experience is the same either way. You're constantly under pressure, constantly reacting, and always just a little bit too slow. And if you ever fall out of sync, even for a moment, that's it. A Hog connects, and suddenly you're playing from behind for the rest of the game. That's why this playstyle gets so much hate. It's about feeling that no matter how well you play, you're always one step behind the cycle. A great player will outplay you with perfect defense and timing, and you can't do much about it. So, hyperbait. If Hog Cycle is about slowly overwhelming you over time, then hyperbait is the complete opposite, because instead of building pressure, it tries to overwhelm you all at once. The entire idea behind this playstyle is to throw out so many threats that your opponent will physically be unable to respond to all of them. You've got pretty much a deck completely filled with cards that demand a log or another small spell. And then, the moment you finally use one of those spells, the enemy already throws another bait card your way. That's what makes hyperbait so frustrating to play against, because it's not really about breaking through your defense in a clean or controlled way, or outplaying someone. All it does is just spam stuff until you don't have anything to properly defend. At some point, you're probably going to be missing the right answer, and when that happens, you don't just take a bit of chip damage, you suddenly eat a full goblin barrel, maybe a dark goblin locking on, or a full evolved skeleton barrel dropping on your tower, and yikes. Just like that, you have lost a huge chunk of your tower. And unlike something like Hog Cycle, where the opponent tries to outcycle you and deal a tiny bit of damage each time, hyperbait happens constantly, and it only takes one awkward hand or a slightly mistimed spell, and the game can snowball out of control before you really have a chance to recover. But honestly, the bigger issue with this playstyle isn't how it plays, but it's how it's built, because hyperbait doesn't really feel like a traditional deck with a clear structure or win condition. Instead, it feels like a collection of the most annoying, hard to answer cards in the game, all stacked together into one list, usually combined with whatever happens to be strong in the meta at that moment. You end up with multiple win conditions, multiple bait cards, and constant bridge pressure, without much commitment behind any individual play. And that's where a lot of the frustration comes from, because even compared to other spam-heavy strategies, this one feels especially low commitment. At least something like Elixir Golem is building toward one big push that you can prepare for, but hyperbait never really gives you that window. It just keeps throwing things at you over and over and over again until something finally connects. On top of that, it's not even a rare playstyle either. Decks like Expo or Royal Recruits can be just as annoying in their own way, but you don't run into them nearly as often, which makes them more tolerable. Hyperbait doesn't have that balance. While it is strong, It's everywhere, and seeing it over and over and over and over, it just makes the experience worse every time. And even when you do end up winning, it doesn't feel satisfying. The entire match is stressful. You're constantly tracking spells and rotations, constantly trying to stay one step ahead, knowing that if you mess up once, the damage adds up immediately. But oftentimes you don't even really mess up. You just don't have a response. So even though it might not always be the most overpowered strategy in the game, in terms of how it actually feels to play against, hyperbait is easily one of the most exhausting playstyles Clash Royale has to offer. Alright, calm down. Now, if hyperbait is about overwhelming you with constant pressure, Elixir Golem Healer takes that idea and pushes it even further, because instead of slowly stacking small advantages or forcing mistakes over time, it just builds one massive push and dares you to stop it. This playstyle is probably the closest thing Clash Royale has to pure, unapologetic spam, where the entire game revolves around defending a push and then counter-pushing by dropping the Elixir Golem in front of your remaining troops, stacking a battle healer behind it to heal it all up, and adding as many other support troops as possible until the push becomes impossible to deal with. What makes it so frustrating is that even when you do everything right on defense, it still feels like you're losing, because by the time you can finally clean everything up, the damage has already been done. This whole playstyle really started back in 2019 when Elixir Golem was introduced. Now on paper, it looked like a high-risk, high-reward card since it actually gives your opponent Elixir when it dies, which should make it dangerous to use recklessly. But that weakness didn't last very long once players figured out how to build around it. A couple of months later, Battle Healer was added, and that's when everything changed, because now you had a way to keep the entire push alive for far longer than it should be. Instead of the Elixir Golem breaking apart and giving your opponent value, it would just keep getting healed over and over again, while the support troops sat behind it doing all the real damage. By the time you finally managed to take it down, your tower was already gone, and the extra elixir you received didn't really matter anymore. The frustration with this playstyle comes from how little it actually asks of the player using it. There's no real need for precise timing or careful elixir management because the strategy is always the same. It doesn't try to outplay you in small interactions like cycle decks do, and it doesn't chip away over time like bait decks do either. It just forces a single moment where you either have the exact answer or you don't. If you fail to stop that first push, the game is basically over. And even if you do stop it, it rarely feels rewarding, because it feels less like you outplayed your opponent and more like you just barely survived something that shouldn't have worked in the first place. Even after multiple nerfs to both the Elixir Golem and Battle Healer, the playstyle never fully disappeared. It still shows up essentially outside of top ladder, where players can get away with committing everything all at once without being punished as consistently, and that's part of why it remains so annoying, because it doesn't really matter how strong it is in the meta. The experience of playing against it stays the same. You're forced into this high-pressure situation where everything depends on one defensive sequence, and if that sequence goes wrong, there's nothing you can do to recover. The reason it's never overpowered, though, is that it's matchup dependent, and there are many decks that can easily counter Elixir Golem. But in a way that makes it all the more annoying to me. The fact that an Elixir Golem usually loses and still plays it and then wins against me makes me very annoyed. If Elixir Golem is about one overwhelming push, then Expo is the complete opposite, because instead of ending the game quickly, it drags you into a slow grind where every interaction feels like it's costing you more than it should. Facing this playstyle feels less like a normal match and more like a game of attrition, where you're not trying to win so much as you're not trying to fall apart first. At the start, it feels more manageable. You defend the Expo, stop it from locking on, reset, and do it again. But as time goes on, something starts to change. Each defense becomes a little more expensive. You're committing more elixir, using more spells, placing more troops just to keep it from connecting. And even though you're technically defending everything, it never really feels like you're gaining anything from it. That is the core of this playstyle. It doesn't overwhelm you with damage, it just drains you of your resources. You might stop the Expo once, twice, maybe even 3 times in a row, but eventually you start running low. Your elixir doesn't quite recover in time, your hand wasn't perfect, and the moment that happens, the Expo locks on. and once it does, that's when everything collapses, because all the effort you spent defending suddenly does not matter anymore, and you're just watching your tower get shredded while you don't have the elixir left to stop it. On its own, expo can be dealt with. If you have something like a giant or bowler, you can tank for it, soak up the damage, and take it down without too much trouble. The problem is that you're almost never dealing with just the expo. It's almost always paired with a Tesla, and that's when it turns from manageable into frustrating. The Tesla exists purely to stop the exact counters you are relying on. You send in a tank, and the Tesla pulls it away before it can reach the expo. You try to build a push, and it gets picked apart before it even gets close. With how quickly it attacks, it shreds through anything you try to use to break through, while the expo sits safely behind it, completely untouched. Once you add in cheap supports like Knight and Ice Spirit, it becomes incredibly difficult to ever get a clean connection onto the expo itself. And even in the rare situation where you do manage to break through and gain some momentum, that is usually when the playstyle shifts completely. Instead of trying to attack, they fall back into full defense, placing their expo and Tesla deeper on their side and turning the game into a stalemate. At that point, you're the one who has to make something happen, but attacking into that setup is a nightmare. Your tanks get destroyed, your troops get chipped down from distance, and nothing ever really reaches the tower. Meanwhile, they can slowly chip you out with spells, and there's nothing you can really do to stop that damage. You're forced to play into their defense, and that's exactly where they want you. It used to be even worse, because in the past, players could take this to the extreme and just force draws by defending endlessly without ever needing to deal damage. If they knew they couldn't win, they'd just lock the game down completely, and you were stuck trying to break through something that was never meant to be broken. It's better now than it was back then, but that underlying playstyle is still there. And while expo isn't nearly as common as something like hyperbait or hog cycle, that almost makes it worse in a different way. You don't face it often enough to get used to it, but when you do run into it, that experience is so slow and draining that it just sticks with you. It's not the kind of deck that overwhelms you instantly or catches you off guard. It just slowly takes control of the game until you don't have anything left to fight back with. And by the time you realize that, the match is already out of your hands. Alright, so lumberloon is the complete opposite kind of frustration, because instead of wearing you down, it tries to end the game in a matter of seconds, but not quite the same way as something like the Elixir golem. This playstyle is built around sudden, explosive pressure where one push is all it takes to completely swing the game. The combination itself is simple, a lumberjack paired with a balloon, but the way it plays out makes it incredibly hard to deal with if you're not perfectly prepared. The lumberjack acts as a mini tank that clears out whatever you try to use to defend, and once it goes down, it drops a rage that turns the balloon into an even bigger threat. What would normally be a manageable situation suddenly speeds up to the point where you don't have time to react properly, and if that balloon locks onto your tower for even a second, the damage adds up incredibly fast. What makes this playstyle so frustrating is how little setup it needs. There is no slow buildup, no warning, and no real opportunity to stabilize before the pressure hits. If you don't have a building or hard counter ready in your hand at the exact moment, well, you're already at a disadvantage. And that becomes even more noticeable when it's used as an opening play, because you haven't had time to cycle, you don't know your rotation yet, and you can easily find yourself holding cards that just don't deal with it properly. In that situation, it doesn't feel like you got outplayed, you literally didn't get the chance to respond in the first place, and sometimes the game can be over just like that. And with Evolved Lumberjack, it becomes worse. Even if you rocket the lumberloon, you now have to deal with an invincible lumberjack that can easily deal over 1,000 damage to your tower. Even in games when you're defending well, the pressure never really goes away because there's always the threat of it breaking through if you slip once, and that is where cards like Freeze make the whole thing even worse, because just when it looks like you have handled the push, everything gets locked in place and the balloon gets those extra few seconds of free damage. Defensive troops stop attacking, swarm units disappear, and suddenly a push that should have been fully countered still ends up taking a huge chunk of your tower. It doesn't slowly take control like Expo or overwhelm you with constant spam like Hyperbait, it just creates these sudden high-impact moments where everything depends on a single interaction. And when those moments don't go your way, it doesn't feel like a back and forth match, it just feels like the game slipped out of your control before you had time to do anything about it. Royal Giant can make you feel even more helpless though. It forces interaction every single time it's played. The Royal Giant itself is already difficult to deal with, not because of any complicated mechanics, but because of how straightforward it is. It doesn't need to cross the bridge and fight through your troops like a normal tank. It just plants itself at the river and starts shooting your tower from a distance while soaking up damage. That alone changes how you're forced to defend, because if you don't have something like a building or a very specific counter ready, it's almost guaranteed to get damage, and not just a small amount either. But the real issue with this playstyle isn't just the Royal Giant on its own, it's how the rest of the deck is built to remove your ability to counter it properly. The Fisherman is a perfect example of that, because instead of letting you use your tank killers the way you normally would, it just pulls them out of position completely. You can have the exact right answer ready, something like a mini P.E.K.K.A. or a Prince lined up to shut everything down, and it just gets dragged away before it can do anything. And that is where Hunter comes in, cleaning up whatever gets pulled and making sure there's nothing left to stop the Royal Giant from getting value. Together, that interaction feels way less like you got outplayed and more like your defense just wasn't allowed to function the way it was supposed to. And this is what defines the playstyle. It doesn't try to overwhelm you with numbers or outcycle your counters, it just forces you into situations where you have to respond immediately, while also taking away the tools you would normally use to respond. You're always reacting, but your reactions never feel fully effective, because something is always disrupting them. Even swarm units aren't reliable anymore, especially with the evolved Royal Giant, since it can deal with small troops on its own while still pressuring your tower at the same time. He became even more noticeable over the past year, especially as Royal Giant started getting paired more consistently with stronger support option. God, I bit my tongue. He became even more noticeable over the past year, especially as Royal Giant started getting paired more consistently with stronger support options, and the playstyle managed to stay relevant for a long time even through multiple nerfs. It wasn't just something that appeared for a single balance change and disappeared again, it kept resurfacing in different forms, which made it even more frustrating to deal with because you could never really wait it out and hope it fades from the meta. And on top of that, the addition of stronger support pieces like the evolved Royal Ghost in late 2025 only added to that pressure, because now you weren't just dealing with a tank and a fisherman setup, you were also dealing with a fast, invisible threat that could slip into your defense and force even more awkward responses at the worst possible moment. Even after several adjustments across the board, the core structure of this deck stayed intact, and so did the feeling of having to constantly respond under pressure. More recently, the Fisherman losing its slowing effect in April of 2026 also reduced some of its control over defensive interactions, since it no longer disrupts response timing in the same way it used to, but even with that change, the core problem hasn't really disappeared. As long as Royal Giant can sit at the bridge and immediately demand an answer, while layered support like Hunter and Royal Ghost still interfere with how you're trying to defend, that playstyle continues to feel uncomfortable to deal with. And that's what really separates it from the other annoying strategies. It's about forcing interactions in a very controlled, very one-sided way. You don't get to decide the terms of the defense, you don't get a moment to stabilize, and you don't really get breathing room to reset the game. Every time the Royal Giant hits the bridge, you are immediately put into a reaction test where anything slightly out of place can turn into tower damage, and when you combine that with support cards that actively disrupt your answers, it creates a constant feeling of being under pressure that never fully goes away for the entire match. My god, man, even just talking about those decks gets me heated. But hey, if you want to hear some hot takes about tower troops, well, I've got a video lined up for you right here. Click on it and I'll see you there.